assumption questions. Now, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be going through this workbook, and I'm going to be highlighting the ideas that I think are important. I'm going to be note-taking on the side here, and I'm going to be educating myself as well as the readers and watchers on today sufficient assumption questions. So a sufficient assumption question has a lot in common with the necessary assumption questions you just looked at. Both ask you to identify the missing gap in the author's reasoning. So we're looking for the missing gap in the author's reasoning. Sufficient assumption questions, however, differ in that they aren't asking you an assumption that is required. So they italicized it, we're going to underline it, by the argument. Rather, they simply are asking you for an assumption that, if true, there's our if, would allow for the conclusion to follow. In other words, they are asking you for information that would prove the conclusion true. Because of this, sufficient assumption questions will often have credited answers that are stronger, broader, or more far-reaching than credited non-necessary assumption questions. Let's revisit the Ronald Reagan example, and this is an example that they've been going back and forth on in the book. Ronald Reagan ate too many jelly beans. Therefore, he was a bad president. Now, when we originally analyzed this argument, we identified the huge assumption that this argument makes, namely that eating a certain quantity of jelly beans reflects in some way upon one's skill at being a leader of the free world. This is a necessary assumption. If eating jelly beans didn't reflect at least somewhat upon Reagan's ability to be president, this argument has no hope of proving its conclusion. But what if the LSAT was willing to grant to you a premise that said the number of jelly beans one eats is the only indicator of one's ability to preside? Would that do it for the argument? We don't need jelly beans to be the only factor, but if they were, would the conclusion follow logically? You bet it would. Try the negation test, though. If eating jelly beans wasn't the only indicator of Ronald Reagan's presidential prowess, would the argument fall to pieces? This is what separates sufficient assumption questions from necessary assumptions. The credited responses can be more extreme, and the negation test can help us. Let's look at an example from a real past LSAT. Pull my book over here. So here is our argument, but following the step process, we're not going to read the argument first. We are going to read the question first. Here is our question. The conclusion above follows logically if which one of the following is assumed. So we're going to say that this question here is logical if we add in one of these assumptions down below. So let's go on to the question now, knowing this, that there's a broken chunk in here that we need to find the assumption. The only pre-existing recordings that are transferred onto compact disc are those that record companies believe will sell well enough on compact disc to be profitable. So most classic jazz recordings will not be transferred onto compact disc because few classic jazz recordings are played on the radio. So our conclusion here is, looking at the information, is most classic jazz recordings will not be transferred onto a compact disc. That is our conclusion, and I'm going to mark that with that little C around sign. And because few classic jazz recordings are played on the radio, that is a premise. And then moving forward, there's a little bit of background up here. So now that we've dissected the question, let's look at our answer choices. Following the conclusion above follows logically if which one of the following is assumed. So few of the pre-existing recordings that record companies believe can be profitably transferred to compact disc are classic jazz recordings. Few compact disc features classic jazz recordings are played on the radio. The only recordings that are played on the radio are ones that record companies believe can be profitable, sold at compact disc. Most record companies are less interested in preserving classic jazz recordings than in making a profit. No recording that is not played on the radio is one that record companies believe would be profitable if transferred to a compact disc. So looking back at this, we're going to have these few answer choices, and we see that our conclusion is most classic jazz recordings will not be transferred onto a compact disc. Under the premise, because few classic jazz recordings are played on the radio, and this is the assumption, what's the missing thing here? Why are few classic jazz recordings played on the radio? Because they're not profitable. So with that idea in mind, few of the pre-existing recordings that record companies believe can be profitable transferred to companies are classic jazz recordings. That looks like a pretty good answer choice to me. So now if we can go check the answer. Not correct. So learning here. Few compact disc featured jazz classic are played on the radio. The only recordings that are played on the radio are ones that record companies believe can be profitably sold as compact disc. Most record companies are, this is another one that we might look at. And most record companies are less interested in preserving classic jazz recordings than in making a profit. No recording that is not played on the radio is more than record companies have believed would be profitable if transferred to a compact disc. So let's follow their pathway on how to crack it. What makes this a sufficient assumption? Here it is. The conclusion above follows logically if one of the following is assumed. It says it is an assumption. The word assumed can reliably tell you that you're looking at an assumption question of some sort. Notice, however, that the test writers aren't asking for an assumption on which the argument relies or depends as they did with necessary assumption questions. Rather, they're giving you a hypothetical. If you plug this answer choice into the argument as a missing premise, would it be enough to prove the conclusion is true? So let's analyze the argument. Just as you did with necessary assumption questions, you'll start off by looking for the argument's conclusion and premises. Here's the argument one more time. The only pre-existing recordings that are transferred onto a compact disc are those that record companies believe will sell enough on a compact disc to be profitable. So most classic jazz recordings will not be transferred onto a compact disc because few classic jazz recordings are played on the radio. So, conclusion, jazz recordings aren't going to be there. So author's conclusion. So most classic jazz recordings will not be transferred onto compact disc. We did our conclusion correctly. Author's premises. The only pre-existing recordings are transferred are those that believe will sell well enough to be profitable, and because few classical jazz recordings are played on the radio. Author's assumption. The purpose of this argument is to interpret evidence. Notice that the premises are facts, not problems or another opinion, and the conclusion is not disagreeing or offering a solution. So the assumption that there are no other factors that determine why record companies might transfer a recording to a CD. So there's no other factors. The good thing about sufficient assumption questions is that the correct responses don't introduce new information. Instead, they make the connection between the premises and the conclusion as strong as possible. Go ahead, make a wish for the answer choice that would do the best job of sealing the deal on this conclusion, and you're likely to find something similar in the answer choices. In this case, there is the language shift between the sales of CDs being profitable and records played on the radio, in which recordings record companies will transfer to CD. You'd love to see an answer choice telling you that the only recordings that would be profitable are the ones that are played on the radio. Keep your wish in mind as you go to the answer choices. The credited response to a sufficient assumption question will make an explicit connection between the premises and the conclusion, strong enough to prove the conclusion. Let's try this. There we go. New page. Step 4. Answering use process of elimination. Now go to the answer choices, keeping in mind that your correct answer choice must prove the conclusion and will not bring in new information. Let's take a look. Few of the pre-existing recordings that record companies believe can be profitably transferred to a compact disc are classic jazz recordings. This may seem helpful at first, but how does this link to the recordings being played on the radio? If anything, it's more of a rehash of the conclusion. This doesn't create a link between the premises and the conclusion that proves the conclusion is true, so get rid of it. So it seemed helpful at first, and that's the pitfall that I fell into. Few compact discs featuring classic jazz recordings are played on the radio. Here's our missing radio link, but here is the link, but where is the link to profitability? The answer looks like an existing precedent, which certainly helps, but doesn't prove the conclusion is true, so cross it out. The only recordings that are played on the radio are ones that record companies believe can be profitably sold as compact discs. Be careful here. You may decide to keep this on the first pass since it looks radio play with profitability. Read this choice again and notice the direction of this answer. That profitability proves radio play. We need to prove that radio play guarantees profitability. So close, but it has to go. Most record companies are less interested in preserving jazz recordings, than in making a profit. This choice is bringing new information, so that doesn't tie the positive profitability with radio play. It's out of scope, so cross it off. E, no recording that is not played on the radio is one that a record companies believe would be profitable is transferred to a compact disc. Wait, what did that just say? I got even tripped up trying to read it. So no recording that is not played on the radio is one that record companies believe. No recording that is not played on the radio is one that record companies believe would be profitable if transferred to a compact disc. Excuse me. Wait, what did that say? The double negative makes the answer difficult to pass through the answers because it includes both radio play and profitability. On the second pass, get rid of the double negative. No recording that is not becomes a recording that is. So a recording that is played on the radio is one that record companies believe would be profitable if transferred to a compact disc. If you add this to the premises, the conclusion clearly follows directly to the premises. If this is the missing link, showing up the gap between the language of the premises and the language of the conclusion. So that is our last little chunk of information that we are looking for there, if you wanted to read it on the page yourself. So, summary. Cracking sufficient assumption questions. Sufficient assumption questions always bring up the ideas and the conclusions discussed in the premises. The credited responses will make an explicit connection between the two, positively sealing the deal on the conclusion. One on more difficult systems. Focus on proving the conclusion and making sure the answer choice goes in the right. Eliminating answer choices that bring in new information that doesn't get you any closer to the conclusion. Look for the strongest answer. So sample question phrasings. Which of the following in our ACT properties identify the conclusion, premises, and assumptions of the author? Look for language in the conclusion that is not accounted for in the premise. Paraphrase an answer that was strongly conclusion and eliminate answer choices that bring in new. Break here. 10 seconds of deep. All right, so let's get to lesson 4, weaken questions. Weaken questions ask you to identify a fact that would work against the argument. Sometimes the answer you pick will directly contradict the conclusion, so we're looking to work against the conclusion for weaken questions. At other times, it will merely sever the connection, so the difference between the premise and the conclusion, destroying the argument's reasoning. Either way, the right answer will exploit a gap in the argument. There's in between the premise and the conclusion, there's that logical area that we either assume, weaken, strengthen, or fill in. So the argument, here we go again. Let's try it, without reading this passage before, never seeing it before. Let's go. I'm going to make a mistake here. I know. They have the trap to make you learn. The top 50 centimeters of soil in Toliga Island contain bones from the native birds eaten by islanders since the first human immigration to the island 3,000 years ago. A comparison of this with the underlying centimeters of soil accumulated over 80,000 years reveals that before humans arrived on Toliga, a much larger and more diverse population and diverse on Toliga. So, my first mistake, I did not read the question stem first. So let's repeat. Which of the following statements, if true, most seriously weakens the argument? Okay, now reread the argument. The top 50 centimeters of soil on Toliga Island contains the bones from native birds eaten by the islanders since the first human immigration 3 years ago. A comparison of this top layer with the underlying 150 centimeters of soil accumulated over 80,000 years reveals that before humans arrived on Toliga, of humans, the population and diversity of birds on Toliga. So we have our first premise up here, and then we have our second premise here. we see our conclusion thus. Humans dramatically decrease the population diversity of birds. This is our statements, if true, most seriously weakens the argument. Once again, we're getting there. Let's bring the bird species to have been eaten by the islanders had few natural predators on Toliga. Well, no, that strengthens it. Many of the bird species that disappeared from Toliga did not disappear from other similar uninhabited islands until much later. Once again, we see that the bird species disappearing at a different time without humans, that would actually strengthen the argument. The arrival of a species of microbe, so this is new information here, carried by some birds but deadly to many others, immediately preceded the first human immigration to Toliga. Okay, so that's interesting. Let's hold on to that one. Bones from bird species known to have been eaten by the islanders were found in the underlying 150 centimeters soil. Well, no one gives a shit about that. I mean, that's not helpful at all because the birds that, like, turkeys were here before we ate them. So that doesn't mean that after we eat a bunch of turkeys that it doesn't help. The birds that lived on Toliga prior to the first human immigration generally did not fly well. Once again, not important. So my idea of an answer choice here is going to be that it's going to be C. So as we work through this passage, maybe we'll find out if I'm correct or not. Or maybe, I fell into a trap, and we'll find out more. So assess the question. Always go to the question first. Once again, that's where I screwed up. Which of the following, if true, most seriously weakens the argument? The word weaken, or one of its synonyms, undermine, call into question, cast doubt upon, is a clear indication of the kind of question you're facing here. We're facing a weaken question. You want to find a way to hurt the argument's conclusion. So we want to break the premise and the conclusion. Now we want to analyze the argument. As usual, start by finding and marking the conclusion and the premises. And because the right answer on a weakened question will often attack a conspicuous problem with the argument's reasoning, you also need to look for the reasoning before you proceed. Here's the argument. Bones from native birds eaten by islanders since the first human immigration to the island 3,000 years ago. A comparison of this top layer with the underlying 150 centimeters of soil accumulated over 80,000 years reveals that before humans arrived on Toliga, a much more diverse population dramatically decreased the population and diversity of birds on Toliga. So, like we said, author's conclusion. The authors are responsible for the birds declined. And like I was saying, no other factors. That's where we're going to get our damn microbes. That's where they're going to come in. Events, one must have caused the other, and that nothing else could have been a factor, that there is no other cause. On a weakened question, the right answer will exploit that flaw somehow. In this case, you anticipate that the answer choice you want will describe something else that could have caused the drop in bird population. Reason why the author's conclusion might not, despite the true premises offered in a support of the conclusion. So moving forward, we're going to have step 4, answering using POE. My thing over, get it at that 90-degree angle, that you guys all like. Keep your eyes on the prize. Remember that what you want is something that hurts the conclusion that humans are responsible for the bird's decline. A, the bird species known to have been eaten by the islanders had few natural predators. Does this hurt the conclusion? Not really. If the birds had few natural predators other than humans, then this choice doesn't hurt the conclusion. If anything, it could strengthen the conclusion by showing humans were the biggest predators of the birds. This goes in the wrong direction, so cross it off. Okay. Many of the bird species that disappeared from Toliga did not disappear from other similarly uninhabited islands until much later. Does this hurt the conclusion? If the same birds that disappeared from Toliga after humans arrived did not disappear from other islands, then it's more likely that these caused the decline on Toliga. This choice also goes in the wrong direction, so cross it off. These microbe and the others preceded the first human being immigration to Toliga. Does this hurt the conclusion? You might initially off by the mention for another reason that the birds decline. If a microbe that kills many birds was introduced to the island just before the humans arrived, then the microbe could be responsible for the decline. If so, that wouldn't hurt the conclusion, so keep it. Bones from bird species known to have been eaten by islanders were found in the underlying 150 centimeters. Does this hurt the conclusion? Not really. So the same birds eaten by the islanders were there before the humans were. Nice to know, but this isn't a potential reason for the decline of the birds, so eliminate it. The birds that lived on Taliga prior to the bird's ability to survive. You may want to keep this on for the first pass. You have two choices left, a circumstance you'll frequently encounter on the LSAT. A new technique. Excited. That was a poor star. On weekend questions, your task is to find the strongest attack on the conclusion. There might be more than one answer that seems to be working against the overall reasoning, so you need to go back, make sure you understand the conclusion fully, and then look for the one that has the most direct impact on it. Things that can be important here are quantity words and overall strength of the language involved. Generally speaking, because you want a clear attack, you'll often see strong wording in the right answer. More important, you want to make sure that the conclusion squarely. Try comparing the impact of your two remaining choices in the previous example. As a reminder, here's the argument's conclusion. The arrival of humans dramatically decreased the number and diversity of birds on Taliga. And here's C. The arrival of species of microbe carried by some birds but deadly to many others immediately preceded the first human immigration to Taliga. Does this really hurt the conclusion? Since the reasoning of this argument assumes a causal link between the arrival of humans and the decline of birds, then by offering another possible cause, say a microbe, this answer makes a direct attack on the conclusion. So keep it. By contrast, here's E. The birds that lived on Taliga prior to the first human immigration generally did not fly well. Does this really hurt the conclusion? While this choice may seem to have potential, it lacks the detail needed to tell definitively if this was a problem that could have caused the birds to decline. You don't know if the birds never flew well, like penguins or ostriches, even when they were thriving. New development that just made them easier prey for predators. The answer is wrong, so eliminate it. Seems to do the job. Make sure you go back to the conclusion and look for the choice that attacks it most directly. So, let's look at a new arguments technique. There are a few classic patterns of reasoning that show up repeatedly on the LSAT. It's helpful to become familiar with these so that you can more easily recognize the assumptions that are built into them. A causal argument. A causal is short causal with a possible cause for that effect. A causal argument also assumes that there was no other. The argument on the page 46 is an example of a causal argument. Take a look at this simple causal argument. Every time I walk my dog, it rains. Therefore, walking my dog must be the cause of the rain. Absurd, right? However, this is a classic causality. You see the observed effect, it's raining. You see a concurrent event, walking the dog, and then the author connects the two by saying that walking his dog caused the rain, thereby implying that nothing else caused it. So why are causal assumptions so popular in the LSAT? Because people often confuse correlation with causality. Let's call the possible cause A and effect B. Then let's map out the common assumptions when working with a causal argument. Something caused B, that is, B didn't occur by chance. Nothing other than A could have caused B. B did not. Because once you know what potential weaknesses are, it becomes much easier to identify the accredited response for assumption, weaken, and strengthen questions. Unnecessary and efficient and sufficient response will be you've identified. Weaken questions, the credited response will suggest an alternate cause for an observed effect. For strengthening questions, the credited response will eliminate or give more evidence linking the stated possible cause with the stated effect. An argument. Another popular type of argument on the LSAT is the sampling or statistical argument. These arguments have a conclusion that is based on a survey given that an individual or small group is representative of a large group. Sampling assumptions. A given statistic or sample is representative of the whole. The sampling was conducted correctly. All right. Whenever you see something about a group used as evidence to conclude something, if we have a small sample, bad. That's just a statistics idea, but I have a science background, so that really helps me. Arguments by analogy. Analogy. A third type of common flawed reasoning on the LSAT is argument by analogy. Arguments use a comparison to draw the conclusion about a certain group. In this case, the author assumes that a given group idea or action is logically similar to another. Arguments or actions are comparable. To weaken such an argument, we would need to. So now we have another practice argument to work with. But before we go, let's take a 10-second break. Breathe in, breathe out, relax. It's thundering outside. I'm in South Florida right now, so it's a wonderful June 1st day, 43 days out from my own personal MCAT, so it should be a wonderful time. All right, let's get back into it. BAR, the National Tea Association, cites tea recent visibility in advertising and magazine articles as evidence of tea's increasing popularity. I catch faster and faster. Which of the following, if true, most seriously weakens BAR's argument? Read that question first. This is interesting. Check out law schools with the most liberal students. All right, anyways, moving on. Read the question first. BAR, the National Tea Association, cites tea's recent visibility in advertising and magazine articles as evidence of the tea's increasing population. However, a neutral polling company, the Survey Group, has tracked tea sales at numerous stores for the last 20 years and has found no change in the amount of tea sold. We can thus conclude that tea is no more popular now than it ever was. So, thus conclude, our conclusion is here. We have two opposing ideas, but our premise, however, this is our big premise here that we are looking at, that he is basing this off of, and this is the idea that he is disputing. So this is the idea that he's disputing. So now that we've broken that down, which of the following, if true, most seriously weakens BAR's argument? So BAR's argument is that tea is no more popular now than it ever was. So, and the survey here says that over 20 years, tea has remained the same. So what's the difference between it remaining the same and it being no more popular? So let's fill in the blank here. The National Tea Association has announced that it plans to carry out its own retail survey in the next year. That doesn't weaken anything. A survey by an unrelated polling organization shows that public is generally receptive to the idea of trying new types of tea. Again, it's close. It's saying new types of tea. That's a red herring. You know, it's trying to get us off the trail of new information. The survey group is funded by a consortium of consumer advocacy groups. Cool. The stores from the survey group collected information about tea sales are all located in the same small region of the country. Ooh. So we see that, remember we said small equals bad earlier? Well, same small region, and on my initial pass, never seeing this question before, that makes me want to keep that one. Tea has been subject to an expensive and efficient advertising campaign funded in part by the National Tea Association. That has nothing to do with it. It just means they failed. So here's how to crack it. Assess the question. So, like I said, read the question first. Which of the following, if true, most seriously weakens BAR's argument? Clearly, you're out to weaken the argument. Step 2, analyze the argument. Read the argument carefully, identifying the conclusion, the premises the author offers as evidence, and any assumptions he or she makes. Here's the body of the argument. We did that up there. Did you recognize this sampling argument? The conclusion suggests that tea has not gained in popularity over the last 20 years. What is the author's evidence? A survey study. Whenever they poll or study as a lookout for flawed sample reasoning. So that's what we did in our answer choices over on the other page. And that the sampling was conducted correctly. Here, the disagree purpose structure helps you as well. The author's tea association position and using the study as, let's summarize. No more popular than it ever was? Yeah, that's exactly what we did over the last 20 years. Okay. Author's assumption that the survey group is representative of the tea market. Step 3, act. You're looking for evidence that the sample problem that the sample in the survey group's data, them all using their information here, and answer all these questions. Be careful here, because your potential problem with the data might seem out of scope because it introduces new information to something in the body of the argument. Let's look at them one by one. The has announced that it plans to carry out its own retail survey in the next year. Does it and to do its own survey? That doesn't invalidate the survey group's information. Cross this one. So it had no effect. It's just something for the future. B, a survey by an unrelated polling organization shows that the public is generally receptive to the idea of trying the new types of tea. Does this show a potential problem with the data collected by the survey group? Well, different results from a different source could potentially weaken the initial data. Keep this one for now. The survey group is funded by a consortium of consumer advocacy groups. Does this show a potential problem with the data collected by the survey group? There is not enough information here to connect how the group is funded with the findings of the group. This is out of scope of argument. Get rid of it. D. The stores from which the survey group collected information about T cells are located in the same small region of the country. Does this show a potential problem with the data collected in the survey group? This is what you need to be careful of. The choice may seem irrelevant at first glance, but if all the stores are in the same region, it is possible that the T sales have increased in other regions. A larger group is all this effectively weakens the argument. T has been the subject of an expensive and efficient group advertising campaign. You don't know if the campaign worked or that the tea has become more popular. Eliminate it. You did keep B at first. The idea of trying new types of tea does not prove tea is more popular. Choice D does not require additional justification to make it weaken the argument. So it is the better choice. So let's look at our summary now. Cracking, weakening questions. Remember these two key ideas when answering weakening questions. The correct answer will probably attack one of the author's assumptions. So we're going to attack an assumption. And you should treat each answer choice as hypothetically true, looking for its direct negative impact on the conclusion. On more difficult weakening questions, there will often be an appealing answer that with just a little interpretation looks right. The key is to avoid making any new assumptions when you try to determine the impact of an answer. Look to eliminate, not to justify. Which of the following, if true, would most undermine the author's conclusion? Which of the following statements, if true, would most call into question the results achieved by the science? Or, most weaken. Anything to make it feel less powerful. And the conclusion, we identified the premise, and we've got to come up with our assumptions of the author. Read critically, looking for instances in which the author made large leaps in logic. Then when you go, and that large leap comes between the conclusion and the premises, this area right here, that is where we have our assumptions, and that's where we can either break the premise, break the assumption. Assume all choices to be hypothetically true. Yeah, so hypothetically, they're all true. That's the fun thing about this LSAT test. All you got to do is imagine that you know nothing about the outside world and just believe everything on the test and go from there. So lesson 5 is going to be strengthening questions, and I'll come back to that in my next live stream. So thank you for chilling with me for these first, for the second edition, but the second 2 of the LSAT logical reasoning sections. And thanks, Princeton Review.